Welcome to EPG Pathshala. In this module, we are going to look at the concept of social exclusion, how it should inform the ways in which social policy is formulated, and why is it relevant for social workers. This is as part of the course on social policy. I am Dr. Shuli Kumar, Associate Professor, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. The topics that are going to be discussed in this particular module are the concept of social exclusion, the links between poverty and social exclusion, different aspects of social exclusion and its manifestation in people's lives, social policy and social protection and how they can address social exclusion, and a summary of the same. The concept of social exclusion is critical for us as social workers, and it's also very important when we are analyzing social policies and programmatic interventions within India. The concept of social exclusion can be interpreted in various ways depending on the context as well as subjective experiences of the people. So sometimes when we listen to people or we talk to people and ask them, do they feel excluded? Maybe some people in the urban slums in and around big cities would explain exclusion in different ways, that I don't get water regularly, or I cannot send my child to the Anganwadi, or I am not able to go for treatment to the local hospital because it's too far away. So that all that are some of the components of social exclusion, and therefore it really covers a large range of issues such as equality, equity, inclusion, deprivation and many others. Stresses on the logic of cumulative disadvantage. We need to stress on the notion of cumulative disadvantage. It's not that one single dimension of a person's life that creates social exclusion. It is not just about the identity of the individual or which social group that particular person may belong to, but it is a cumulative disadvantage that a particular person belongs to or is living in, that creates social exclusion, and it affects the most deprived segments of the society. Social exclusion occurs where different factors combine to trap individuals and areas in a spiral of disadvantage. A small example perhaps that I can use to illustrate what social exclusion is with regard to a child who lives in a nearby compound near the Tata Institute. When he was asked that when you were shifted from Rear Road, which is a posh South Bombay area, to the Lalubhai compound in the M ward, what is it that you found different in your life? And the boy turned around and said that, one, it is very unclean and very difficult to live in, and second, I don't like these flats. In Ray Road, we lived in small houses which were essentially constructed by the family themselves, but there was plenty of space for me to play and meet my friends, and I made many friends in that particular locality. But in these flats, I hardly get anyone to play with, and there is no space to play with in the compound itself. And also it is very unsafe for me to be here on my own. So therefore I would much rather live in Ray Road than live in this particular compound. And that is what social exclusion experience is for this little child who is living in Lalubhai compound. So therefore the definition of social exclusion can be a vast definition. And let's look at what Esteville has when he talks about transferability of social exclusion. Social exclusion may be understood as an accumulation of confluent processes with successive ruptures arising from the heart of the economy, politics, and society, which gradually distances and places certain persons, groups, communities and territories in a position of inferiority in relation to the centers of power, resources and prevailing values. This is precisely what I mean, that Rear Road had to be converted into a prestigious and rich locality, and therefore the so-called eyesores, that is the people living in the slum colonies, had to be shifted into a more disadvantaged location of the M ward, and how that created how they created further disadvantage and underprivilege for the communities who were shifted here, who largely belong to Dalit and Muslim identities and communities. So, in many ways, Estiville has given a very comprehensive understanding of social exclusion. There are other discourses which you would like to look at, though we do not subscribe to all of them, but it's important to know what are these discourses on social exclusion. The one that is very often used is the notion of redistributive discourse, in which the central problem is seen as lack of resources amongst the poor, such as access to collectively provided services as well as lack of money. In this discourse, poverty remains at the core, and especially income poverty. The other discourse is the social integration discourse, wherein it's mainly concerned with inclusion and integration, in which social exclusion has been primarily construed as labor market exclusion. That is, that people are poor and they do not have work, and hence that's why they are being excluded. So those who are poor, since they don't have work, need to be integrated or included, and therefore given some form of work so that they can come out of poverty and exclusion. The other third discourse is the moral underclass discourse, which says that behavioral or moral deficiencies are the problem of exclusion, and these people don't want to work and therefore they are excluded. There is some problem with them, and therefore it is a mental health issue, it's a social and cultural issue, and it needs to be addressed as such. All three of these definitions are actually quite incomplete and do not give a comprehensive understanding of what social exclusion really is and how it operates in people's lives. So let's look at the linkages between poverty and social exclusion. There is an ongoing debate and disagreement about exactly what poverty is. So therefore, even poverty as a definitional issue is very problematic, and how one should seek to define as well as measure poverty. Because unless and until the nation or the duty holders or the people who are responsible to address poverty measure it or define it, there will be no poverty, there will be no policy to address poverty. So the different ways in which we define and measure poverty, the various facets of the problem that is then revealed, leads to different demands of policy actions. So how poverty is defined by different people then defines what should be the policy. And there are different forms of policy responses to poverty therefore. Hence the definition of measurement of poverty is directly linked to how policy is constructed to address poverty. It is definitely understood that poverty needs to be alleviated. All social policy dimensions and state stakeholders as well as civil society stakeholders do understand that poverty needs to be alleviated, and policy needs to be therefore created to address poverty issues. However, different formats of understanding of social exclusion and poverty inform the ways in which policy is constructed, developed and actually implemented. So social policy and poverty need to come together, and we need to understand these two. There are different ways in which kinds of poverty have been explored. So there is the notion of absolute poverty, where poverty means being without the essentials of life, what we call as the basic needs, and therefore refer to subsistence poverty. However, in practice, what is essential for life varies according to subjective context of an individual, such as where and when one is living. So, for example, a person who is living in the village maybe has a piece of land as an asset, but it is not being productive because of climate change, and there is a drought in the village, and that person and his family migrates to the city and does not have any format of assets with which he can make a living in the city. One, the person may not have the adequate skills to do the kind of work that is required in an urban setting. Second, may not have adequate money to actually start a business or an enterprise on their own, and may not even have any possibilities of thinking of alternative livelihoods. In that case, how do we look at absolute poverty? So it is actually contextual and changes and varies over time. So that is very significant for us to keep in mind when we are looking at policy and programmatic interventions. Relative poverty, on the other hand, takes up the notion of changes in predetermination of poverty levels over time and place. So relative poverty is measured based on what are the differences over several decades or several years. So it is a very different way of looking at poverty lines and poverty outcomes and who are the poor. There is another new definition and measurement of poverty linking income to social security benefit levels, which highlights that despite general increases in in affluence and improved conditions of living, there is a need for improved social protection. So what we hear nowadays is that the rich are becoming richer and the poor continue to be poor and perhaps fall into extreme poverty. So analysis of the income levels, the way it is varied, what are the differences in a particular state, nation or community, is something that informs the poverty measurement and the ways in which social security or social protection policies need to be articulated. So that difference needs to be addressed, and poverty alleviation programs therefore need to be shaped in that context, is what this particular perspective looks at when it tries to define poverty. The idea of exclusion again goes on, is a critical dimension of looking at poverty, which means non-participation in key social activities need to be taken on board when we are looking at social exclusion and also looking at multidimensional poverty. So some of the key social activities could be consumption, that is ability to purchase goods and services; production, that your ability to participate in economic or socially valuable activity; ability to be politically active and be part of the local and national decision making; social interaction with family, friends, neighbors and communities; the most marginalized people in a particular context, and the nature of their poverty and vulnerability analysis is also very important to locate when we are looking at social exclusion, as well as looking at how do we define poverty and what is it that we are looking for in terms of equality and inequality in its context. So multidimensional poverty analysis is able to enable us to look at these particular dimensions of accessibility and participation and inability and ability of different people, and then in that case we are able to probably come up with a better definition of poverty and measure poverty in a more comprehensive manner. So social exclusion, let's look at some of the critical aspects of social exclusion then in such a context. That group-based disadvantages, that is one of the key aspects of social exclusion, that is social hierarchies and relations that define certain groups as inferior to others on the basis of their identity. That is a key source of disadvantage. So group-based disadvantage is something that should inform any understanding of social exclusion in any particular context or society. And of course lifelong discrimination, which results in chronic poverty, not only from having fewer assets to fall back on in times of crisis, but also from cumulative impact of discrimination, risk, vulnerability and exclusion across an individual's life cycle and between generations. So sometimes it's good to look at some of the biographies of marginalized people, be it from a tribal context or from a caste Dalit context, to actually understand this whole notion of lifelong discrimination and how, despite all efforts by individuals, they are not able to come out of these discriminatory processes throughout their life cycle, and therefore are more vulnerable than many. So for example, the denotified tribes are more vulnerable among the tribal communities because they are labeled as criminal and they are not able to access many of the social services that are available to them in terms of health, education, because the discriminatory attitudes, stereotypes they face is acute. So generationally they face chronic poverty, because there is no access to education or any kind of resource which will bring them out of poverty. So the systemic exclusion is what one is talking about, and its operation in society, it creates exclusion. So it is not only limited to the operation or of discrimination at the level of the household. It is also the ways in which power is allocated to certain privileged groups in a society, and how that power gets perpetuated within those privileged groups and within those privileged caste groups and elites, which creates further exclusion. And this perpetuates and permeates in the various institutional settings, which includes the bureaucracy, which includes the state systems, which also includes societal and local governance systems as well. So exclusionary forces are often derived from prejudices held by more influential members of the society. This is something very hard for many elite, even academicians, to understand, that discrimination is not just based on lack of access to resources or not being able to access educational or health sources or many other services or rights, but it is also because of the discriminatory attitudes, the ways in which it is framed, the way in which the institution operates, that creates exclusion. And the influential members therefore love to perpetuate that systemic discrimination and not acknowledge that they really exist. It manifests in various forms of discriminatory practices, such as institutionalized biases against marginalized groups, institutional blindness to the needs of vulnerable groups in the population, such as people with disabilities, and cultural and social practices that delegitimize claims. So if today a child of a denotified tribe wants to study in a private school that is happening under the right to education, the usual dialogue that we hear from the private schools is that this child will not be able to adjust with all the other children because he has to match up to the levels where these other children are. Now, in that case, discrimination is obviously going to be perpetuated by the school system. No matter that the child may have the capacities to compete, learn, and be able to engage with whatever is happening within the classroom. Yet private schools deny and deprive many of such children admission in the elite schools. To give, and therefore delegitimize many of the claims that children from economically backward communities actually rightfully should be able to access. These exclusionary forces results in unequal power relations at all levels of the society. Therefore, if such children do not get admission in the elite schools, the perpetuation of inequality will continue and will shape and design even the schemes and programs that are being promoted for the marginalized sections of the society. It will come with a sense of hierarchy and hegemony and a notion of beneficence rather than as rights holders. So the other dimension which we often do not bring into the discourse of social exclusion is the disadvantage due to area, that is the geographical location. So structural disadvantage may arise in form of inadequate infrastructure such as roads, weak communication systems, no internet access, absence of government and private sector services, greater likelihood of exposure to natural disasters. Say for example, the hilly districts may face greater forms of social exclusion than perhaps the plain areas which are more accessible. Similarly, the northeastern region of the country has always been social excluded, and groups and communities living out there have been deprived of basic services which are rightfully theirs under the constitution, because there has been a blindness to the geographical location of these communities, recognition that within those geographical locations the policies, the programs need to be structured keeping the geographical problems and adversities in mind. These disadvantages often because of geography really create further marginalization of already existing communities and groups. And therefore governments have to play a special role to articulate policies which are also locale specific and specific to the community context, and also the social realities of such people living in such locations. The absence of legislation that addresses discrimination is another dimension which continues the perpetuation of structural discrimination. If there are no laws to address equal opportunity legislation, to address inequalities, and there are no equal opportunity legislations in place, that often perpetuates the structural disadvantage that certain people or communities may face in a particular country or society. Insufficient investment, while there may be laws, there may be also policies and programmatic interventions, but budgetary allocations, that's what we mean by insufficient investment. If budgetary allocations are not made adequately to ensure that the programs reach out to people and that it takes into consideration, say for example, the geographical difficulty, the discriminatory attitudes, the barriers that are created by societal structures, if adequate budgetary allocation is not done, and even if budgetary allocation is done, it does not reach the people who it is meant for, then discrimination continues, and structural discrimination continues to create more and more barriers for people to access these basic services and programs to come out of poverty. So poverty then becomes a cyclical process wherein discriminatory practices continue, and the poor continue to come from the marginalized backgrounds and get more and more vulnerable, and the risks of their falling into chronic poverty becomes higher. Therefore, there is a need for social inclusion, and talk of such social inclusion becomes critical when we are looking at social policy. Social exclusion constitutes a specific form of understanding that participates in construction of both social problems and also policy responses to it. That is something we have understood. So therefore, the idea of related concept of social inclusion can be a good tool to reform policies and programs, change them, make them more transformatory. So therefore, how will we include different marginalized vulnerable groups into possibilities of coming out of poverty is something that we need to understand. So social exclusion is tied to powerful concepts of creating solidarities and social citizenship, thereby what we are talking about, collectivizing and empowerment of different people from different marginalized groups, sections and societies. Further, there is an increasing recognition among leading politicians and policy makers that poverty and social exclusion are global. So it's not something that is local only. The local ties up to the national, and the national ties up to the global context and the international arena, especially in the neoliberal arena that we are today living in. So social exclusion and social protection therefore need to go hand in hand. So if we are talking of social inclusion, social protection needs to include and promote the possibilities of disadvantaged groups to participate in decision making and participate in the overall governance and democracy of a country. So social protection is linked to the vulnerability and risk that a particular household or community needs to ensure. So different people have different capacities to cope with same risks. So if there is a disaster situation, we find that it's the women and children who are the most affected, because they've not been able to come out of homes, they've not been able to access newer livelihoods, and it's the men who are able to go further from the areas and find out possible better livelihoods. So there the impact is very gendered. So the risks that they face of exploitation, of violence is higher for women and children than for men. So to give as a example, so people's experience of chronic versus transitory forms of poverty and deprivation will depend on these divergent experiences and possibility of discrimination in that specific context. It is important for social protection schemes, therefore, to address not merely the income deficits that arise, but also the existing structural vulnerabilities which are there existing because of societal oppressive nature and cultural constructions. So tackling social exclusion requires that social protection policies have a programmatic intervention which reaches out to ensuring the empowerment of marginalized groups, the possibilities of the marginalized groups to articulate exactly what they need. So participation of marginalized groups is essential for actually even conceptualizing a social protection program or defining a social policy outcome as a possible way of ensuring that there is equality being promoted within a country. Social policy and social protection, therefore, both need to be transformatory in potential. It can play a very important role in empowerment and promotion of citizen rights amongst the marginalized society, social groups, and therefore the support for such dimensions need to address the notion of governance, work with the duty holders not just to change their mindset but also ensure participation of and engagement of people from different sections, gender, caste, the intersectionalities of social stratifiers, to make their voices more visible. So social policy therefore is required both to tackle the risk that leads to exclusion, for example unemployment, low skills, illness, low wages, and to prevent the development of new social problems. Because the more if social policy is blind to social exclusion, then more and more social problems will emerge. Unemployment will lead to different crime situations, and then crime will lead to more marginalization of existing discriminated groups. So it will form a vicious circle, and therefore social policy needs to address these dimensions of social exclusion to prevent newer possible social problems that may emerge in a society. So in summation, the module has explained the critical concept of social exclusion, which is linked to the formulation of social policy. So policy making cannot be done by elite privileged groups. That is a critical idea that social exclusion promotes. So instead of the trickle down approach of policy making and policy formulation, what is required is consultation, participation, and dialogue with the marginalized and vulnerable groups to conceptualize policy in itself. The various ways in which social exclusion therefore can address discrimination is by ensuring access to resources and actual reduction of poverty through these processes. So only the poorest can tell you what exactly they require, only the marginalized can tell you how they are discriminated, how systems need to change, how non-discriminatory behavior can be propagated within the elite and the policy implementers and the duty holders. And social protection policies therefore then only can become transformatory and can empower the marginalized groups to come out of poverty, and that is a critical dimension that this particular module has brought in the forefront. Thank you.